Nice to meet you all. Hi. Thank you, Freya and Parasite, for having me here. I have just arrived and I've learned a lot. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, but if you wouldn't mind, I have a few as well, and I'd like to put it to the speakers. And I mean, it's interesting because Freya, with no bad feelings, whatever, I find this really interesting because the program you sent me, the title is actually different from the title you have. And I thought it's a very interesting sort of point to start. My title is Exhibition as Places for Political Action. So instead of exhibition as sites for direct political action. So I thought those differences are crucial, and it's very interesting. And I just share some ideas I've had on the title, and then maybe we could open this up for discussion. I was thinking of how exhibitions could become places for political action. Is it by choice or by exigency or by contingency? And then secondly, I mean, the idea of place. Exhibition is itself, if exhibition is itself a place, and if it sort of takes upon itself the task of placemaking. So we are talking about places upon places. I think some of you mentioned a bit of this in your presentations. I thought this might be relevant. And then thirdly, I was thinking in terms of the visibility of political action. Are we talking about political action as, okay, step back. By action, I associate mostly with results of actions. If we talk about activities, though, if we talk about acts of politicization or acts of depoliticization, we might be sort of expanding what we are trying to look at. And so in that sense, in that light, I was thinking whether how important visibility of acts of politicization is. Do we now see, or have we always been seeing acts of politicization that is not visible, or where visibility is not relevant or important? So that's the general thing. And then for each of you, if I start with Hendrik, I was fascinated by the big I mean, the whole presentation, but a question that you asked, can exhibitions create such conditions for, direct political action? And I wonder if you could elaborate on, what kind of conditions there could be. And then for Clara, it's wonderful to hear about the history. And then I wonder because, I mean, the quote you used at the end of the presentation about these artists not seeing themselves as talking politics, by doing such things in the institution, of doing this exhibition, which for me is political or politicizing the history of Hong Kong, perhaps. The fact that they don't see themselves as making or engaging with politics, and perhaps the representation of the history of Hong Kong in that institution as a kind of politicization. In relation to this group of artists, is there any, research findings that you've got about how these people actually are a collective or not? My interest, I think, is in terms of the relation between collaboration and collectivity. Like, when does collaboration become or sustain as a certain collectivity that sort of goes on with political action? And then lastly, for Lyno, it's a huge topic, and I'm totally ignorant on it. But my question for you is actually, you seem to have mentioned or touched on this realm where there are political actions by artists that pose a challenge to art or artists as a group or as a community. And this is what I was thinking when you were showing the banner as well. So we are looking at political action by non-artists, for instance, having an impact on artist community, positive or negative or otherwise. And I'm interested in how that could be developed. Thank you for the time.
Thank you for your questions. Great. Yeah. So, what kind of conditions? It's a question I'm struggling with, and I'm wondering if it has to do with the intent of something as well. Maybe sort of I start a bit with responding to Clara, actually, because I thought her sort of expansion or sort of elaboration of what an exhibition can be, and if we take sort of, Tony Bennett's sort of exhibitionary complex text as a point of departure, everything can be an exhibition, everything is an exhibition, I guess, in a way. But for me, it's very clear when you talk about sort of the umbrella movement or sort of the Lion Rock statement and calling that an exhibition, it's an exhibition with a very clear intent and an intent to act in a way, and it produces the conditions in that sense almost like automatically through and by itself. And of course, just to take that one step back, there have been some initiatives, at least sort of in the context where I come from, where artists have been engaging in, let's say, actively building a sort of a political theater or like a parliament. One famous example, and I hesitate to mention because I don't necessarily agree with it, is Jonas Staal, who is a Dutch artist, and he, in the past few years, has built this sort of New World Summit where he actively engages sort of politicians in, I don't know, kind of building something in between a school and sort of a parliament and calling that an exhibition as well. So really sort of recreating a conversation as a political statement. And then, suddenly it seems if we go to an exhibition which has a very different history, I guess, I mean, as an exhibition of visual arts, suddenly the question of representation comes in, right? Like an artwork about, let's say, an artwork about the refugee crisis, for example, just to take a very sort of topical situation. That artwork can represent something, but does it, encourage or intend to act? And I guess that's sort of the differences and sort of the layers that I also wanted to impose, which in a way goes, back to institutional critique as well, in a way, when you say like institutions are like powerless to act or something, but in that you also make a very clear distinction between the space of an institution and, let's say, what is considered public space. I also don't want to be the person that says that the exhibition is that institutional space that is not part of a sort of public realm and thus cannot empower people to do anything. I just wanted to suggest a question of representation and how we figure this out. This is not a direct answer to your question, because you were asking sort of what are the conditions that an exhibition can produce. And I guess I was also triggered by the word direct, because it implicates something different for me. I'm going to stop talking now and think about it a bit. Yeah.
My turn. So when you were asking about the collective, actually it was interesting. I didn't have enough time to actually talk about all the details, but so you remember the Low-Ting Stories exhibition. This is really much a curator, really driven. He was really driving the whole exhibition. So the artists involved, don't you think they were basically really producer? Of the kind of to support their idea. And I do know that some artists probably also were not all the time comfortable about that. So yeah, I was actually romanticizing when I say, it was a collective collaboration about the cultural identity of Hong Kong. But then later on I found out it probably there are different kind of thoughts and feelings behind.
But how did they work? I mean, perhaps in a very basic sense, if one talks about a collective, then there are certain kinds of significant relationships between these people, right? It's not like they work in their own studio and do their own work to present in the exhibition.
Well, from my understanding, but then maybe later reconfirm, no, it was at the beginning one of those key figures in the curatorial team who kind of construct the whole story. And then actually, by invitation, they talked to each artist. And then in those days, there was no Facebook group or, so by phone call. you know, like Stella Tan was like calling everyone individually to talk about, oh, please, I will give you 3 pieces of paper. You will come, please join us and, you know, talk about the past and present and the future of Hong Kong. It was really like, you know, like that. And because of the great amount of artists involved, yeah, you sort of probably like can imagine the administrative level of work would be kind of basically, you know, stuck, well, not stuck, but yeah, like the level I was describing. Yeah, and so maybe not so much all the way collective collaboration, but at the starting point, a small group start first.
So it's like a fabrication of a community for a fabrication of Hong Kong history, and then after the exhibition, it's sort of dismissed?
For some, well, actually, for example, for the second time, I think it's more or less, yes. Yeah, it was that.
Thank you, Yeung, for your question. If I understand correctly, you asked about political action by artists or non-artists in that case. And what I try to sort of like provoke is actually it's more like political action by states, right? So in this case, like, you know, artists who were, or works who shown in those kind of festival become or subsumed by this larger ideological machinery of power to, you know, convert or coerce or, you know, influence. But however, I'm trying to also reflect on sort of contestation, and that within those kind of like space of coercion, there's always sort of like a possibility for liberation, and hence that I raised an examples by artists or photographer, filmmakers who, you know, were part of that but managed to be able to get out of that system and produce something out of the intention of the larger sort of like system. Also, I didn't raise you know, other initiatives much beyond the competing states because my evidence still sparse. However, there was, you know, during that time, there was also initiatives by painters, Cambodian painters, and even among themselves were contested. That they are divided, and one was sort of like leaning towards sort of the Sihanouk pro-culture, great image of modern Cambodia, everything so prosperous. Now we are, you know, capable, independent, we can produce anything we want. We are also like prosperous on that camp, but also there's another camp of artists who, you know, reject that sort of like grand narrative, but inflict with the actual reality of the farmers in Cambodia. So instead, one group drawing, you know, great, happy Cambodian rural fantasy on the other side, like really depicted farmers in like unhappy, you know, condition. And so I try to, yes, you know, hope to draw to these sort of contestations of exhibition site among the states, but also among sort of like citizens and that refuse to follow that grand narrative of the state as well.
Maybe, I mean, it certainly speaks to what you were saying earlier, like the visibility of political action. I think, I mean, you're still sort of researching about, I was wondering what kind of awareness there was in the time that sort of photographic exhibition Life in America was on, like, you know, what the ideological implications of such an exhibition and sort of persuasive intent was in that sense, and also like, let's say, sort of the US or like the CA's efforts to, yeah, like sell abstract art or abstract expressionism as sort of a product of America versus like the social socialist realism of the Soviet Union. These are all like ideological projects that operate on the level of propaganda. So yeah, it's interesting. Like maybe I can sort of push it towards a question like. In terms of like visibility of political action, if you can sort of elaborate a bit more what you are thinking of in that respect, so we can respond to it.
Okay. I think I'm thinking of political action that is intended for to be seen, to be captured in the media, to be spread out, like messages like that. And there are artists who are doing that for art. There are non-artists doing this that makes an impact on art. I'm really specifically thinking about the banner. But then there are also perhaps, it doesn't have to be micro, but what I have in mind now as an example might be micro relations that people get themselves into that might politicize a certain relation. For instance, in the Hong Kong Art Center, being from Hong Kong perhaps it's better if I speak to that. It being an institution, this wasn't commented on just now in the presentation, and I want to know if the artists were thinking in terms of what kind of negotiation they are engaging with. Presenting the exhibition at the Hong Kong Art Center at the time in those historical specificities, which I'm not sure. So that this is a kind of, if you sort of engage yourself in a particular kind of negotiation, which is maybe not visible to the larger society, but potentially could turn this group of artists who are supposed to be just exhibiting in the exhibition, but then with this engagement and negotiations, perhaps there's a chance for this to become a collective or a republic somewhat. It's that, no? I don't know. Should we invite, everyone to contribute questions and comments as well?
Absolutely, we welcome questions. We love them. Upstairs.
Hi, I'm actually in the process of thinking, but I will try to exchange. The title of this panel it's make me a bit skeptical about the word direct action, maybe similar to what Hendrik tried to say. My question is, if art actually function that way, like, the visibility of political action, because from my observation in my country, sometimes when artists try to politicize themselves in a very obvious way, it tends to be kind of propaganda. Even, we likely to call it other words because we might agree with that. So, but in its essence, maybe it's worked that way, but we will call it propaganda if it's produced by the authority or the government. So I'm not sure about this as well. So let me share about one example. It's actually, I was going to respond Miriam, the former panel about her exhibition that I talk about past unquiet. That because last night I talked to one student in Bangkok. He told me about his final thesis. He undergrad student, and his proposal of his final project is about a photography. But the problem about what he's going to do, the issue that he's going to portray, to create imaginary situation when the king of Thailand died. Because we all know that the king of Thailand is dying, so he's going to do that process. But artists should be free to imagine, right? But we're not allowed to imagine that way. And so this student need to change the topic because he was threatened by some professor, by some teacher in his department. So I have agreed to work with him, I mean, after I go back. But so I have a question, maybe if you have any idea, how actually like political powers in art function that way. But because I don't believe that it could work by like so direct. You know what I mean? Yes.
Yeah, we keep coming back to that word, it seems,
Okay.
direct. I guess it's impossible to have a discussion about the political power without sort of, going back to the age-old discussion of the autonomy of art in a way, which I don't want to do now anyway. Yeah, the political power of art, it's a big one. I'm telling you, I am of the belief, let's say, that indeed sort of artists, as you sort of suggest as well, should be like free to imagine sort of their practice in any way. I'm like, who am I to like dictate what is sort of propaganda and what is sort of a direct political statement, or what is art in sort of that sense. But yeah, of course, there are instances where sort of the intended effect, or sort of the intent aims to be so direct that, you wonder sort of what kind of, maybe as an art historian then, of what kind of art history it is part of then. And that's for me, it's always quite an important, check in a way, to acknowledge that. But other than that, I ain't got the answer to this question. I am relying on my partners in crime here.
Well, I just wanted to say that I thought it was great that the three of you talked about three very different ways to think about exhibitions as sites for political action. One actually really addressing propaganda, which I thought was great to bring that in, the exhibition as propaganda. The exhibition as a site for kind of imaginary politics, and then the exhibition in this kind of site of the periodic exhibition as a site to represent politics, right? Real politics. But you gestured towards it, Hendrik, but we didn't talk about there's this fourth way in which an exhibition can be a site for direct political action, which is the exhibition that is protested or boycotted, yeah? And that's actually a really direct political action at the site of an exhibition. So I don't know, maybe you all can comment on that a bit.
Well, and in terms of the thinking about propaganda, I do think the myth making is a kind of can be a kind of propaganda, can be interpreted that way also. And in comparing the myth making video at a later stage I showed you, and the myth making in the Lo-Ting story in the art institution, actually the art framework kind of helps to protect that myth making not being solely propaganda in that sense, like, because it's in the art center, it's the art exhibition, it's not real. Sort of that kind of protect itself and try to provide the ambiguity. While in the second, in the screenshots of that video of the myth making of the wisdom path, that's why in the end I show some Long-Tin's comment about this myth-driven, utopia-driven way for the for the social movement can somehow be dangerous when it's, we all know about propaganda and fascist idea, and associating with that, it can be dangerous, some sort of.
So yes, exhibition as a propaganda. Yes, I guess what I try to at least illustrate or hint that it doesn't work, right? That this sort of ideological project that intend to convert whatever doesn't work, and there always space, and that's what I believe, you know, whatever intention the artist, and if you do believe that this intention is working all the time, then I think no one wants to keep doing any more creative stuff. But yes, there's always rooms, there's always space, and there's always, you know, point for liberating. And I don't know whether I answered that.
Well, absolutely, thank you for pointing it out. It's a really great point. Yeah, there have been like many occasions actually in the past years, no, like with Sydney, with Istanbul, Sao Paulo was also sort of involved in some controversy where, you know, artists actually take a political stand in that, say, and like other participants as well. And I remember quite vividly, like one of the most uplifting moments of let's say sort of the 2013 Istanbul Biennial was a performance, or a lecture performance actually, by Hito Steyer, which was in your presentation as well, called The Museum is a Battlefield. And it's sort of, it's part of a longer project of hers, and looked into, let's say, you know, funding connections between the arts through the metaphor of a bullet, basically, going around the world, or going from, like, say, a war situation through the Art Institute in Chicago, through other institutions, you know, because there are, unfortunately, these connections. And I feel that biennials and sort of museums and sort of art institutions alike are much more under scrutiny these days, and because it's also much more a public fact in a way. So this is one, and I'm going to put this strongly, this is one way of abolishing the hypocrisy in it, I guess.
Can I, no, just to address a little bit on the word direct, and maybe one should find it so much linked to the directness of it. I don't think that, and I guess most of us don't think that an exhibition actually immediately changes legislation, or visitors who go to a biennial will immediately go to the streets because of, I don't know, the epiphany of whatever happens inside, no? And the directness is more on how somehow exhibitions can be instrumentalized, and I also think that we tend to only think the instrumentalization as only a negative way, as in propaganda, that a certain form of display is instrumentalized for state and global order agenda. But instrumentalization can also be in what Clara presented in her amazing presentation, where this construction of myth is being presented or instrumentalized in such a level that, as you mentioned in a very anecdotal way, a child was being instructed on this new myth, no? And that's what I'm saying. The directness is more on how we deploy that instrumentalization, no? I myself don't think that exhibitions that I make, I literally say that we orchestrate situations, and we orchestrate a bit of that instrumentalization.
Nevertheless, it's interesting that we also choke up when the word direct comes into play. You know, it's an interesting phenomenon. But maybe to sort of extrapolate, and like your question a bit more, it's also a kind of instrumentalization that you're talking about can also happen when you flip it, when a museum or an exhibition is closed down due to certain political situations, which, you know, happened in Makba, of course, not so long ago, and it happens still quite around the world. So sort of the act of censorship, in that sense, is maybe an interesting thing to consider as well when you talk about unintended sites for direct political action. Just to throw it in there.
Yeah, of course, I mean, after experiencing very directly, to use that word, this thing in Makba, I think we really need to rethink how political influence in institution actually acts. We are talking always about the figure of the curator, but after this I have the feeling curators have actually nothing to say anymore, or not so much, so the position is actually very weak. And I think that, but that's another discussion. What I actually wanted to say is that I think politicization is again something different, and that is something that takes place on very, very many levels, I would say. That can be that an artist resists, or even that can lead to a big problem in an institution or something like this, but it can also be, in a broader sense, being politicized by something which happens in a certain city, on the world, etc. So I think, and it's also not alone, no? It's not only an artist group or an exhibition which politicizes. So this is, for me, this is a very important point. And the other thing which is also important to discuss is a depoliticization. So I would say that something like the Istanbul Biennial is a depoliticization of art, much more than a politicization. So how can, in this structure of these big events, which at least need a lot of money and sponsors and are addressing collectors, etc. So how much does it go, how far does it reach that it starts really to banalize and depoliticize art?
I mean, it's also sometimes more insidious than that. I mean, sort of a depoliticization can also exist under the banner of what claims to be a very political exhibition, which was the claim of the Istanbul Biennial, and that's why it was such a massive disappointment. No.
Hi, just wanted to react on a couple of the points that were recently made in the audience about the idea of epiphany and possibly the instrumentalization of exhibition making, and also the fact that our capacity to influence is obviously taking within a context that's the context of the poetics and not directly of the politics. And I would argue to this point that I think if we don't believe in epiphany, then we're in the wrong profession. Just because, you know, I think that, of course, we're not changing legislation, but we're working with artists whose, I guess, intentions, and our intentions as exhibition makers, is to highlight that potential for thought and action. And so I believe in epiphany and that potential for change. That's just to bring back a bit of utopia into the conversation. But my contention as well was to understand the relationship between the first series of conversations and the second one, in that I think Simon quoted Piandasa in saying that we call upon the past to influence the politics of the future. So the first pathway that I'd like to put back on the table is the relationship of history as a memory of political action, and the present relevance of those historical examples that we're bringing that, so the relationship between history and present political urgency. And the second pathway is the idea that you expressed, Hendrik, and actually all of you in different ways, is on the one hand, Clara and Vuth discussed site-specific examples of exhibitions that had to do with the politics in Malaysia or Hong Kong, for example. And so how that, our idea today of a holistic view of certain pockets and myths and cultural identities can also be understood on a global scale, and to go back to your point, Hendrik, in terms of the decentralization. So I guess what I'm interested in is the pathway between like specificity of politics and decentralization. I wonder if that springs some thoughts.
Actually, okay, let me start with the depoliticized idea. Referring back to what I mentioned a bit earlier on, in the Low-Ting Stories exhibition, I think the art space, the gallery, actually helps to, kind of prevent the the propaganda, although the child actually was instructed to the myth. I don't know how he's doing nowadays, but it will be interesting to find out. Actually after that exhibition in 1997, for the exhibition in 1998 and 1999, I was able to find more local news report about those exhibitions. So probably like the myth is being constructed slowly, and nowadays even more people talking about it. And then about the direct political action and also myth and cultural identity. I want to again refer back to the second last slide I was showing about two positions probably nowadays we have in Hong Kong about the imagination of the social movement here. One way probably is to rely on some sort of utopian idealist idea. And then the other one is actually to confront the real. And actually I find the realist, materialist way to say that to confront the real, like all the time, instantly, to confront the real, the real, I mean R-E-A-L, the real is sort of similar to the process of art making, in which you really need to take the risk, constantly. And well, so it's kind of indirectly getting back to the question about the direct political action. If we do at the same time, it is really difficult to require or ask everyone in society to confront the real at all time. No, it's so difficult. Like, if you really think about the art making process, how can everyone be an artist all the time? And be risk-taking all the time. And so perhaps then some sort of utopian idea has to be there in order to drive something forward. Then maybe the way to go is maybe in between, and that's why to be an exhibition, not to be an exhibition at the same time would be great. But I don't know how actually physically to achieve that. But
can I just before answering. Trying to answer your question, what is your reading of decentralization? Because I didn't quite get that.
I guess I was interested in how we can understand, and for example, in the premise of documenta, or what you were giving the example of site specificity of certain exhibitions that deal with, political engagement or artworks how that relates to site specificity when you're actually having projects that are about decentralization as a strategy, but that are perhaps dissociated from the local context. So I guess my question was to understand the political relevance of certain site-specific contexts, but how can we appreciate that or how can we encourage decentralization as a kind of amalgamation of all these smaller narratives?
No, to stick to the very specific example of documenta, it's an attempt to decentralize the exhibition by making it extremely site-specific on the one hand, because it's in Athens. And of course, in that move, also not to fetishize the site specificity in a way. I guess that's an important consideration as well. As soon as you're in a site and a lot of things are unfolding there, it's also very easy to thematize that. And I think it's also about finding the right metaphors and the right sort of approach to actually be in that situation. And then to trace that sort of decentralization, which is, in the way the move to Athens, back to, let's say, where sort of the project has its origins, which is Kassel, which will be then sort of an echo of something. So, I hope, it's truly, and it sounds a bit lame, but the project is called Learning from Athens, and what it at the moment is also truly what it feels for me, to travel with this exhibition somewhere, explore that site and then sort of trace it back. It's truly a process in that sense. So that's the answer that I can give you at this moment in time. Ask me again in 2017.
Just a quick response to depoliticization. I guess, we are all implicated, we part of economics of exhibitions, either whatever, you know. We all be part of these projects that we still today keep, you know, be critical about and criticizing about and looking for, you know, possibility for better answers. And I guess there is no way to escape, right? We are all part of it, so it's a matter of wrestling and playing with available resources and be continuously conscious about, yes, what was the intention of the person or the system above, and what we see and what we think that might liberate. I think, yes, it's a constant consciousness and wrestling around existing structure, and at least poke a little bit and, you know, take a step, take a risk. And I think it's, yeah, I don't know.
Jump, rather than decentralize. It sounds more like to me jumping from hopping.
A leap of
from
faith,
custody.
maybe, yeah.
On that note, maybe we have to start. Oh, Inti.
Just last clarification before we all go to dinner. Know that I do believe in epiphany and in the power of this micro-political. It doesn't matter of the size of the exhibition, of what that can do. And again, regarding this child, I think that what's interesting is that that person or the audiences that went there, they did somehow instructing themselves through something that was completely deessentializing identity. So this is a way, again, to instrumentalize audiences, but in a way that it doesn't proclaim essentialism of identity, which I think is what propaganda and the construction of identity that the state was doing did, and also a way to deessentialize identities is the whole project of Documenta, where it's the antagonism of what the Third Reich was actually proclaiming, which is an only monoculture and one single identity. So anyway, that's it.
So I also wanted to clarify, but I'm doing really short. With depoliticization, I don't mean our all contradiction, but intended depoliticization. I mean, I wouldn't go that far to say this is in Istanbul, because in Istanbul is now is a precarious situation. But what I mean is when on purpose things are getting depoliticized, because if they are politicized, they are making too much troubles. And our all contradiction of being embedded in the system, this we share and we cannot omit, that we must deal with. But depoliticization can be more.
Up. So, what to do? What to do? Are we allowed for one last question? One last question over there.
Abdellah, yes?
Can we do that, please? Thank you, Parasite.
It's a very quick remark, and maybe, I don't know if there is an answer or not, but what I wanted to say about the debate is that an exhibition is always about expression and its expressions, and it's about artworks first, and the curator of the exhibition is this, let's say, platform that is situated between research and action. It is between research and action because an exhibition presents only something that is called advanced research, what we saw in the example you gave. It can be presented because it can be understood as an advanced, and it is not action yet because it is in a space of exhibition. It's not. Even if we produced it in a space, it needs a reading, it needs some interpretation, and we can talk about the exhibition as a tool, but it's not active yet. So this is in this space that is in between, that can be considered as a space of encounters. But it's not yet action, so it is really between research and action that took out a 60s movement in Morocco, like this, that you know what I'm talking about, Soufle, it is breath, so it can be this space of breath that is not out yet, that is just an attempt, let's say.
That's really important.
Yeah,
It gives birth to something.
But it is, I mean, we should talk about this more tomorrow, I think, because it is in a space of visibility and publicness. So I do wonder how we can continue that argument a bit. But there's no time now, but there's like 5 hours tomorrow, so that's good.
Thank you so much. Thank you.